Levantor, delivering sovereign spatial intelligence that gives nations the ground truth.
Hello and welcome back. I'm recording this podcast on a Sunday afternoon because of domestic travel, and so if any earth-shattering events have occurred by the time you're listening to this, I apologise for that, but you know the reason why. And also, if you hear any strange background noises, that will be Brian, my cat, who is snoring away, sleeping in the sun. Okay, to business, and this episode is very heavily oriented towards foreign policy and international relations, though I'm going to try and, as always, relate as much of it as I can to Australia and our national security needs. So the Strait of Hormuz idiocy continues, and Donald Trump's latest idea is to impose even stronger economic sanctions on Iran. I mentioned last time, I think the chances of that working are close to zero. But I want to move on to talk about the UAE, which I've done before, and the reason why will become apparent in a moment. Because of the enemies of Iran amongst the Gulf states, or amongst the Middle East more generally, the UAE is pretty much on the top of the list. And the current ruler is Sheikh Mohammed bin Zayed, sometimes known as MBZ, the 65-year-old ruler of Abu Dhabi. The UAE is made up of 7 emirates. I'm not going to go into their complex political system, but for the moment, you just have to worry about MBZ. Now, he is the most rabid of the anti-Iran Gulf monarchs. As I have said before, the country, which only has 1.1 million citizens, the other 9 million are expats from all around the world. Anyway, it is unbelievably wealthy because of a huge amount of natural gas in particular, but other energy resources. And as well as their rabid anti-Iran campaign, I've also touched on the fact that they actively interfere in the affairs of other countries, most prominently in the Libyan civil war, and arguably even more tragically in the huge humanitarian disaster that is known as South Sudan. They were participating in the conflict in Yemen, but they were backing a faction that Saudi Arabia didn't like, so the Saudis bombed one of their arms shipments, and they, the UAE, have subsequently withdrawn. They are investing huge amounts of money in corrupt African countries, such as the Democratic Republic of Congo, buying up, among other things, rare earth deposits, and in this regard they are, or will become, a rival of Australia's. So I ask again, as I have done in the past, why have we given them about $100 million worth of AMRAAM missiles, and why is one of our Wedgetail airborne early warning and control aircraft, which costs at least $250,000 a day to operate, probably more, why do we have that deployed over there helping out the UAE in their war against Iran? And by the way, this is not in the slightest a pro-Iranian comment, a country which is run by a bunch of theocratic mass murderers. Now, unfortunately, my observation is that the quality and experience of Australian national security advisors has been atrophying over time. I hardly ever meet any of them personally, but I know who they are. And the quality of the people involved has been in decline for a while, and I wonder how many of them could actually find the UAE on a map, let alone understand the true nature of the regime that they are supporting. It is so typical of this government and the coalition to think of anything outside the framework of the perpetual US alliance as simply too complex for them to worry about in the slightest. So I think the thought process has gone like this. Military and defence advisors support the UAE because that helps them with their post-retirement income. In a previous podcast, I mentioned that easily 100 former senior ADF and AFP people have travelled to the UAE to earn heaps of money. You're paid in US dollars, you pay no tax after their retirement. So, there would seem to be at least a very slight vested interest on the part of these people in, doing the right thing by the UAE and hoping that the favour is going to be returned. The favour that we're doing is being paid for by taxpayers, that is, you and me. Now, then, the national security bunch of the bureaucracy, who are meant to be a little bit separate from defence and they're meant to be objective, they probably think that, well, the UAE is a strong ally of the United States, therefore the UAE must be supported. I really suspect it's as simple as that. And as I've said before, I think Australia is entitled to ask for at least $1 billion for the military assistance we are providing. But now to an even more consequential matter, and that is Donald Trump throwing a close US and Australian ally in the form of South Korea under the bus. You might have seen the publicity about this. A couple of days ago, Trump cancelled or tried to cancel a big military exercise with South Korea, but perhaps even more significantly, started going on about his friendship with North Korean dictator Kim Jong-un and is hinting that he wants to meet with him later in the year. Now, let's be clear. Kim Jong-un is another mass-murdering tyrant. This creature is on the same level as Vladimir Putin, another dictator that Donald Trump continues to hero worship. In North Korea, there are anywhere between 80,000 to 200,000 political prisoners who are tortured, starved, executed, and worked to death. Their sentence is lifelong, and they are sent to separate penal camps away from the rest of the prison population from which there is no escape. Now, the North Korean economy is improving, mainly because of support from Russia, in exchange for North Korea supplying troops and munitions to Russia for their ongoing invasion of Ukraine. But look, it's an awful place, and there's no way that anyone in their right mind would prefer North Korea to South Korea, which is a vibrant democracy with a thriving economy and a huge amount to contribute to the rest of the world. I keep on going on about South Korea. Everyone should visit. It's a great place, and it just defies belief. And I can only imagine the scale of the horror amongst South Koreans at seeing Trump now actively backing the murderous regime in the north. And on top of that, Kim Jong-un and his regime are increasing their stockpile of nuclear weapons so that they can continue to threaten not only South Korea, but also Japan and the United States. Does anyone else note the irony that Trump's stupid war against Iran is supposedly to stop that country acquiring nuclear weapons, but at the same time he is pathetically slobbering all over the boots of the leader of a rogue nation that's building more nuclear weapons every year? The difference in attitude between the two, well, I don't know. I'm not a confidant of Donald Trump's, but I can make an educated guess, and it's this. The Iranian regime has nothing but utter contempt for Trump and his enablers, including prominently the State of Israel. But the North Korean dictator previously wrote letters to Trump, flattering him, presumably describing him as the wisest person on the planet, and all of that sort of BS that Trump absolutely laps up. Now, When Trump announced that he was trying to pull the plug on this joint military exercise, I think that was on Monday of last week, what he said on public was just a series of lies. He has come up with this fictional story that South Korea needs to pay the US more money for the US having, Trump said, 39,000 troops on South Korean soil. It's more like 25,000, but don't worry about the numbers of people. That really doesn't matter. It's the basic principle of money owing supposedly to the US, and his claims that under Joe Biden, payments from South Korea were reduced and only Trump, can get them back up to $3 billion a year or something like that. Now, none of this is true. That when you subject any of this to any form of scrutiny, South Korea has been paying the United States, various amounts of money over time to support the presence of US forces on South Korean soil. And so it's just completely wrong to say that somehow that South Korea is freeloading. As well as that, this issue of troops on foreign soil comes up in other contexts as well. And the truth is that if Trump were to pull those troops out of South Korea, which he may well do, and could also pull them out of Japan, well, they still have to be accommodated somewhere, which is presumably back in the United States. So rather than the Koreans and the Japanese paying or partly paying for the support of all of these guys and girls and all of their very expensive equipment, all of that instead would have to be paid by long-suffering US taxpayers. So, this just makes no sense whatsoever. Now, let's pivot back to Australia and the connection and why all of this matters. Because the way things are going, South Korea and the US might actually end up having a pretty serious rupture over all of this, for reasons that I think people should be able to understand. This, by the way, is despite the South Koreans last year giving Trump a replica gold crown when he was visiting for an APEC meeting. So, lavish gold gifts in this case don't seem to have had any particular effect. But I wonder if this split between South Korea and the US could also affect the relationship with Japan and also the one with Australia. As I say, North Korea is threatening Japan. Japan is part of the mix. Now, as it happened, our Defence Minister Richard Marles was meeting with his Japanese counterpart just after this Trump announcement had come about. And bear with me, I'm often critical of Richard Marles, but I'm about to read a quote from him where I think he actually gets this right. Asked about, the US cancelling the exercise and trying to get on with Kim Jong-un. Marles says, well, firstly, obviously what the United States does is a matter for it, but let me be clear about a couple of things. Australia is very concerned about North Korea's nuclear program, as well as its missile program, and we have consistently made that point. Indeed, when I was in Tokyo last year, I think there was a North Korean missile test which just occurred while I was there. So, we are seeing that activity happen frequently, and we remain very concerned about it. And in respect of South Korea, this is very important, we see South Korea as a critically important country in terms of Australia's bilateral relationship. Actually, in terms of the way in which we operate, we have conducted trilateral meetings between Australia, Japan, and South Korea previously, and we look forward to further meetings between Australia and South Korea later this year at a defence and foreign affairs level, and we see that we have a shared strategic alignment with South Korea, shared values, shared trust. I think in the challenging world that we face, there are many challenges. North Korea is the author of quite a few of those. We greatly appreciate our relationship with South Korea, but we are very much appreciative of our relationship with Japan. and it forms part of the context in which we have a stronger relationship with Japan than we've ever had. Okay, that's the end of the quote. I was going to read more, but I'm running out of time. Now, isn't that interesting? This is the first time that it looks like Richard Marles is realising that the way that the US is behaving is contrary to Australia's interests. And from his words there, he ain't siding with North Korea. He's not welcoming what the US is doing. In fact, he is saying very clearly, and I believe absolutely correctly, we stand with South Korea and we stand with Japan. Now, let's speculate about the future. We all, many of us like to do this. What might happen? What had happened if the Nazis had won World War II? That sort of thing. So, if the US relationship with South Korea ruptures, I think it's highly likely that that country will move very quickly to acquire a nuclear weapon of their own. This has been discussed in South Korea for years. The country certainly has the know-how. They've got a very large, very successful commercial nuclear industry. They've got a huge defence industry base. They've got all of the scientific knowledge that they need. And I would not be at all surprised if secret preparations have been underway for years. South Korea has plenty of secret facilities all over the place, bunkers deep underground where they could be doing all sorts of stuff that the rest of the world would not be aware of. I've seen public estimates that they could acquire a nuclear weapon between 6 months to 2 years. Everything I know about the Republic of Korea tells me that this would happen ahead even of that schedule. Now, if South Korea goes nuclear, Japan will also follow. Japan has also been quietly preparing for the eventuality of the US pulling out of Asia and withdrawing their nuclear umbrella. And the country has a huge stockpile of plutonium, 44 metric tons to be exact. Now, most of that is stored in Europe, but it still has 9 tons domestically. Now, 8 kilograms gives you a decent nuclear weapon. 6.2 kilos of plutonium was used in the Fat Man device that was dropped on Nagasaki, only about which 1 kilo underwent fission. That's another story. I've seen estimates that Japan could field a nuclear weapon within 9 months of a decision. And again, a bit like South Korea, I very much suspect that reality would be somewhat less. Again, because Japan is extremely efficient. And even the 9 tons of plutonium that they've got domestically is enough for about 1,000 nuclear warheads. Japan might still have to do a bit of further enriching, but that's just a very minor technical issue. How about Australia? Because that's something that I'm surprised that I'm even having to speak these words. But this is the disruptive effect of Trump, which our decision makers continue to deny. Should we consider acquiring a nuclear weapon? Well, it's not a bad time to be thinking about it. We have the scientific know-how, and we have vast amounts of uranium, but a realistic time frame, given that we don't have a civil nuclear industry and we have a very small industrial base, we're talking about 5 years, I would guess. But on the other hand, given that we can't even produce a digital arrival card, thank you, Mike Pizzullo, former head of the Department of Home Affairs, we would seem to be so collectively incompetent when it comes to major infrastructure programs that it would probably take us about a century. But given the way the world is unraveling, and again, this is the Donald Trump effect, and by the way, even if the Democrats were to return to power, and I don't think they will, I've discussed that previously, I don't see any appetite amongst the US Democrats for returning to a previous world where the US was the policeman and protector of countries like Australia. No matter what happens, that era is gone. And given that reality, our defence planners might want to start giving some serious thought to how we should be best preparing for the future. Thank you very much for listening. Goodbye for now and see you next time. I might not be able to record a podcast next Monday because I will be in China attending a pre-APEC media conference. Hopefully I'll have something to report about that. Goodbye for now.
Vantor delivers sovereign spatial intelligence so nations can own the ground truth. See how at vantor.com.